Hi. So we're going to be looking at the Tone Projects Unisum mastering compressor. This was designed by Rune Lund-Hermansen, and I've been chatting to Rune about this compressor, and he's been incredibly helpful in terms of explaining to me some more in-depth information about how some of the detailed controls, which we'll get into, work. And I found that very helpful. I'm going to pass that information on to you as we go through these. So this compressor, I just have to say, it's blown me away like plugins or hardware rarely do. It just sounds fantastic. As a mastering engineer, because I mix and I master, and I concentrate mainly on jazz, world music, progressive rock, that kind of music, I often don't need to compress. And I tend to compress if the music needs gelling, or it needs more punch, or it needs something doing to it that I can't do with EQ. And if it doesn't, then I won't use compression. I often don't. But this compressor sounds so great. Even with a minimal amount of compression going on, it just makes everything sound great. Like no other plugin I have ever used. So it's just really something else. But beyond that, it's also got more control than any other compressor I've ever seen, hardware or software, by quite a margin. So it's really an amazing, amazing piece. Huge congratulations to Rune for creating this. I know it was a long time in the works, and it's paid off because the results are just stunning. So we're going to be going through all of this. If you want sound examples, that's a different video, because there's so many controls to explain and go over here that this is going to take, it took me 25 minutes to explain all of this, and that's going through it pretty quickly. So if you want sound examples, it's linked in a video below. But we're going to be going through all of these parameters and explaining what they all do, and plus handing on some extra useful information. And so I hope you find this useful, and let's have a look. So here we are with the Unisum controls. It's got a collapsible panel here with advanced controls for really incredibly detailed tweaking of this. Rune, the designer of this plugin, was really helpful in giving me some extra detailed information about some of these controls, which I'll pass on to you. I mean, the manual's very good and it covers everything about what every control does, but he gave me some really useful extra in-depth information about some of them, which I'll explain as we go through. So I'm going to start with this collapsed. There's a lot to cover here. It's going to take a while, so I've made a separate video for sound examples, so if that's what you're after, find the other video, which I'll link below. Now I'm going to start with the controls we're all familiar with, which most compressors have. So we've got the threshold, ratio, attack and release, as you'd expect to have on a compressor. And we've got a knee control, makeup gain, a mix control, which you come to expect in modern compressors. And we've got a sidechain high-pass filter. So all standard. But now we're going to move on to the more interesting and unusual controls, and many of them are actually unique controls. We've got sidechain emphasis. Now this basically is like a bell filter applied to the sidechain that allows you to make the compressor react more to certain frequency areas. So say, for example, you wanted it to react more to the 3K area because the mix was a little harsh, you could do that, and so forth. Now what we have here is a relax control. Now this is a really useful control. What this does is, as the signal reaches the most amount of compression, the area of compression where it's getting compressed the most, it relaxes the ratio as you turn it this way. If you turn it down all the way here, it just acts, the ratio acts as a straightforward ratio. But as you move this up, as the signal gets to its loudest, it relaxes the ratio a bit gradually as you move this up. And the effect it has is to open out the sound. So if you get everything set up so it's sounding really good, and it's really controlling the signal and bringing out things you want, but you're finding that the transients are sounding a little crushed, or it just sounds a little like it needs opening up a bit, this is a great control for that. I find myself using this a lot. So that's great. It's got a gain reduction limit, which I wish you saw on more compressors. It is something that you find on other compressors, like some other compressors, whereas the Relax is the only one I can think of that has anything like this is the Flux Solera, which has something, I'm not sure if it really does the same thing as this, but it's a kind of similar, sounds like a similar thing when you use it. But the gain reduction limit, it's so useful. It basically puts a limit on how much gain can happen. So say, for example, during most of the track, you've got the gain roundabout where you want it, the gain reduction rather. But occasionally you get some really loud drum hit, transient of whatever kind, or at a certain part of the song where it just gets louder and it then starts to sound overcompressed. You can put a limit. So you can think, well, I don't want anything to ever be compressed more than, say, 2 dB or 4 dB or whatever you decide, so that when those extra loud things come along, they're not going to sound overcompressed. It's just so useful to have this. So we've got that, and then moving down here, we've got something which, again, it's not something you find on many compressors. It allows you to control the curve of the release. So, as we all know, there are certain compressors, hardware compressors, which have become famous because of their sound, and a lot of that sound is due to the release curve. And as we'll see in a minute, there's a lot more control you can get over the release curve, where it goes way beyond any other compressor I've seen. But just on this starting panel here, you've got a control that takes you from linear curve to logarithmic curve. And this, just on its own, is a really great control for changing the character of the compressor. Generally speaking, if you go this way, it starts to sound smoother, and this way it starts to sound more lively. And it's overall changing the curve of the release. So then we have a solo to allow you to solo each of the channels, and we have this HYGGE. What this does is it adds harmonics in what is quite a complex way. It's not just adding a set of harmonics, it has feedback circuits within it and much more complex type of signal dependent saturation going on, which is based on, although not emulating anything specific, it is based on the way transformers and other hardware react to a signal. So that's really nice, and it adds a really nice thickening sound to the compressor. So we've got the meter here, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of this, but there's different metering schemes. You can click on this to zoom in, which is incredibly useful. We've got, this is incredibly useful. It's a link between left and right that's continuously variable. So over here, the two channels of the compressor are linked, so they will react in exactly the same way to each other. But as you move this up, if you move it all the way here, they're completely unlinked, like two mono compressors, and in between to any degree. Again, this, like some of these other controls, can be controlled much more in a much more detailed manner down here, which we'll see in a minute. But this is so useful. Now, jumping up here, this links the parameters, links or unlinks the left and right parameters. We've got MS mode, left-right mode, super useful, and what you expect in a modern compressor. Here we have a quality setting. So real time is if you don't want any latency. High is probably useful for most settings. It sounds incredibly clean. No noticeable aliasing or anything like that. But if you go to pristine, which uses more CPU, but there's no aliasing on this setting, and it sounds just so superb. Really, really something extra in terms of quality. The whole compressor sounds like that, though. Just everything about it sounds just oozes absolute top shelf quality sound. So now let's move down and have a look in this control panel here. Now this is where all the detailed control is. This compressor, to my ears, as I said, it's in a class of its own sound-wise, but it's also in a class of its own in terms of control. I've never seen a compressor with anything even close to this level of control. It allows you to control everything about the attack and release envelopes in great detail, and we'll see how that works. But if you don't want to get into all the details here, what's really amazing is that there's a menu here that gives you starting points. So they're like presets just for this area here. So you can choose something like firm, and it sets it all up to sound, to firmly grab the material, or you want something that sounds more open, or you want something that sounds like, reacts like a FET compressor reacts. It sets it up like that, and then you can tweak it from there. Or maybe it's already sounding just what you need, and you can simply use these controls to get the sound you need. So it's got opto, varimu, and lots of other really great starting points, which you can then either just use as they are or tweak from there. Pretty much everything you'd ever need as a starting point is in this preset menu, which is just such a great idea. So now going through these controls, this is a wide band compressor. It's not a multi-band, but it has a multi-band, and the reason for that is because you don't want a multi-band compressor for mastering or for something like the drum bus, which this compressor is also amazing at, even though it's basically aimed at the mastering compression area. You have here a multi-band detection circuit. So that's broken up into low, mid, and high. Again, this is not something I've ever seen on another compressor, but that's true of many of these controls. But you'll see it allows amazing control. Here is the cutoff frequency between the bands. You can set that wherever you want. And then looking at the high band, you can control the RMS speed just for the high band. So you could set it slow so that the high band of the detector reacts really smoothly. So high frequencies have a really smooth RMS characteristic to how they react, make the compressor react. Or you could speed up the RMS so that it reacts really in a lively, snappier way, just on the high frequencies. And then here you have separate control over the peak gain. So this is how much the peaks get fed into the detector. So you could have the peaks feeding in a lot or not much at all. So you can have it, this peaks really low down and it's just going to react to the RMS. Put in a lot of peak activity, it's going to react a lot to the peaks. And then moving over to here, we have the weight, which is basically how much each of these frequency bands plays a part in affecting the compression. So if you turn this up, the highs are going to be affecting the compression a lot more. They're going to play a bigger part in how the compressor reacts. Turn it down, they're going to play less of a role. So there'll be less the highs will react less. And here we have amazingly dynamic ratio control, which gives you frequency dependent ratio. So you could take the highs, mids, or lows, like with any of these controls, and you can have a higher ratio for the high frequencies and a lower ratio for the mid frequencies and so forth. So just unparalleled control here. These handy lights show you when the RMS and peak are switching over in terms of what it's reacting to. Here, back to the ratio control, this is how fast the dynamic ratio is going to react. Default or fast reaction time, and that really changes the character a lot. So this is very powerful and really changes the character of the compressor a lot. Now moving over here to the attack and release modifiers. Now here we have complete detailed control over the attack and release. So here we set our basic attack and release times. Here we can control the detailed two-stage attack and release. So how does this work? Well, Rune, who's the designer of this amazing compressor, was really kind to help explain to me some more detailed information about how some of these different things work, which I'm going to pass on to you. So one way of explaining how this works is if you imagine that you had a loud note followed by a couple of quieter notes. This control will give you the time, the attack time for the louder notes, and this will give you the attack time for the quieter notes. So the way Rune explained this to me is that it's to do with a relative compression, where you are at the moment that the compression changes. So wherever you are within the amount of compression at that moment in time, because it's a continually reacting, changing curve. So it's got a very organic sound to it because of that. And what happens is wherever you are at that moment, if it needs to change a lot, it's going to think of it as a loud signal. And if it doesn't need to change much from where it is at that time, it's going to think of it as a quiet signal. This control, the X over level control, is how it decides what's a loud note and what's a quiet note. So if you set it, down here, it's going to, or up here, it's going to set that crossover between what it considers loud and what it considers quiet. And these lights will show you when it's switching between the two. So it's a two-stage release control based on loud and quiet, which is just incredibly useful, and it's for both attack and release. So for example, I could have a fast attack time for loud notes and a slower attack time for quieter notes, so that they would be less affected by the attack than the louder notes, or vice versa. And it's the same with release. I could have the louder notes have a fast release, for example, and this acts as a multiplier. You can see that 3 times X, so it's based on the release set here. That's going to make it 3 times as fast as what this setting is for loud notes, and I could set this as slower so that quieter notes have a slower release. So this is an amazing amount of control and gives you, yes, just fantastic control over the character of the release and the attack portion of the signal. And another interesting thing that Rune explained to me is that this crossover level is a soft knee. So you get a smooth curve between, say I had a fast release time for the loud notes and a slower release time for the quiet notes. The changeover between fast and slow release is a smooth curve, which gives you a really great smooth sound, of course. And it also is affected by the curve you've basically got set here as well, whether it's log or lin or somewhere in between. So again, huge amount of control here. Now moving over to here, we have a memory effect. Now what this is optical compressors. If you push a lot of signal really heavily into them, into the detector, way past the threshold, way into the amount of compression, I mean, not threshold, but a lot of compression, the optical component heats up and it holds longer, it compresses for longer. And so that allows you to do that here, allows you to keep more compression for longer. Kind of slows down the reactivity of the amount of compression, or you can cut back on that and make it react quicker. So you can emulate optical circuits, or you can pull it back this way. Really useful. Transient override, another super useful control. This gives you a separate control over just the transient attack and release. So if you've basically got things right here, but you find that transients want a slower attack or a faster attack, just the transients without affecting the rest of it, you can control that here. And again, this is a multiplier. It's not a multiplier, it adds to or subtracts from the existing attack and release time. So that's different from these, which are multipliers. These are adding and subtracting from it. So if you have an attack time of, say, 30 milliseconds and you want, the transients to have faster attack, you can subtract from that, or you can add to it. And it's the same with the release time. So super useful for fine-tuning the transient snappiness of your compression. Now, here we have another really interesting and unique addition, and this is the secondary envelope. So you have a second in parallel envelope in the detector circuit, which is based on your attack and release and other settings here, ratio and threshold, without reference to these controls. So say you've got this all set up doing just what you want, but it's a little bit too reactive. But you don't want to lose all these settings, but you want it to be a little smoother and a bit less reactive. You can turn this up and it starts to mix in the basic controls settings here in a parallel envelope into the settings you have here, which basically smooths it out. Really, really useful. And you even get separate control here for the second envelope. So say you've smoothed it off, sounding much better, but you really just need a little bit more attack or a little bit less attack, you can add to the attack and release time here. So amazing amount of fine-tuning and control here. Finally, in this section we have the envelope smooth, and this is a filter which further smooths the overall envelope and the mixing of this envelope. So amazing amount of control here. And now we move on to the final section here, which is the channel link section. Now this is super useful. You've got your basic channel link here, as we went over before, where all the way over here these are completely linked and they will react in exactly the same way. Here you have completely unlinked, so it's like two mono compressors, and you can go anywhere in between. But here you have further control. So I'm actually going to start down here. If I have this completely linked, so both these sides are reacting the same way, I can actually unlink just the high frequency proportion of the signal. So if I turn this up towards the high, it starts to unlink just on the high frequencies, but not the lows. Or I can go the other way and unlink just the lows, but not the highs. So if I wanted to just unlink the top end, which could be super useful, you can do that here. So that's with this even set so that they're completely linked, you can override that here. But if we unlink in general here, obviously we can increase that here, but looking at these controls, this RMS peak bias, what this does is it unlinks based on just the peak or RMS value. So say I wanted my peaks to be linked, but I wanted my RMS reaction time to be unlinked. So for example, I liked the general stereo effect I was getting with unlinked, but I felt that the transients, the peak material, was making it jump around too much and spoiling my stereo image. I can link just the peak. Or the other way, I can allow the peaks to be unlinked and just link the RMS information. So amazing amount of detail control over the stereo linking. And that's often been a problem with unlinked, as we all know if we've worked with compressors that allow you to unlink before, is that unlink, that stereo compression thing can sometimes work really great on some material, but very easily can run into problems on other material. And even if it can sound like really great in one part of a song, it's not quite working in the other part, and that's often because you just need to control things a bit more than just simply linking or unlinking. And this gives you all that control. So if you think this unlinking gives us a beautiful stereo image, but it's getting messed up by certain things, you can sort that out here. And the final thing that allows you to do that is this limit control. And this limits the maximum allowed difference of gain reduction between the two channels. Now, I didn't quite get what the difference was between the effect of this and, say, just this, the stereo linking, but Rune really helpfully explained to me, and once he did, it made complete sense to me, that what you can do with this is it's a bit like the gain reduction limit control. Say you've got most of the track unlinked to whatever degree you decide is sounding really great, but there are a few places where it's particularly loud on one side or the other, and it's really throwing off the stereo image. You can simply put a limit on how much it can be affected by a further gain reduction. So you can say, well, it's completely free under 2 dB of gain reduction, but beyond that, it's not going to affect the stereo image, so you're not going to get sudden changes in loud parts. So incredibly useful, gives you complete control and solves basically all the problems we've always had with unlinked channels. So yeah, I hope that was useful. Incredible compressor and incredible control, and Rune has basically thought of every control in the most wildest dream of every mastering engineer and given us all of that, and it's so well implemented, and so much thought and detail has gone into how these controls are set up and react. It's very much not just digital by the numbers. It's very much like organically thought out in this way these controls operate and move, so that you always get musical results whatever you do. It seems impossible to get this compressor to sound bad whatever you do here, and I think that's just because the amazing care and thought that has gone into the work behind the scenes in how these controls react and work. So yeah, amazing work on this. So yeah, I hope you found this useful, and if you did, please do subscribe and like the video, and I hope to see you next time.